language barrier in this case really, I believe, going to take a central role here in terms of the verifiability of this false confession, and also just kind of what the defense is trying to say in terms of their client maybe was railroaded into confessing. Maybe, you know, he didn't know or understand exactly what he was saying. What's your take?
There's no questions that there's issues with the language barrier, the botched Miranda warning from Officer Romero, but really the key piece of evidence the prosecution has and what's going to be fatal for Rivera's defense is he led deputies to the exact spot in the cornfield where Mollie Tibbetts' body was found. So, you know, the suppression issue was litigated. It's going to go up on appeal. We know that the reason that this case is going to trial is because the defense wants to preserve their right to appeal that suppression motion. But really, as far as the defense pointing the finger at Dalton Jack, you know, who has an alibi, you know, ultimately Rivera leads investigators to the body, has Mollie's blood, perfect DNA match, in the trunk of his vehicle, and the Fitbit also. That testimony was very powerful, the fact that she was jogging and then all of a sudden she's placed in Rivera's vehicle. The vehicle goes south, driving 60 to 70 miles per hour. This is an almost all-white jury out there in Iowa. I don't think that the fact that you have an undocumented Spanish speaker is going to help them out there.
Right. It certainly does seem the defense here is trying to muddy the waters in this case and point the finger away from their client, Christian Rivera. Talking about Kathleen Durst, really trying to paint a picture of her being a responsible person, trustworthy, someone who just wouldn't up and disappear on her own without a trace, right?
Right, Derek, and I agree with Sarah on this one. Even though this is about Susan Berman, we really got to go back to Kathy. And I love this testimony of the medical school classmates, you know, talking about how Kathy was a responsible student, would never miss her first day of rotation. And really the fact that her husband, Bob, was abusive, he beat her, you know, and that if she were to disappear, Kathy told her friends and classmates that you should really look to Bob. So I like this testimony. This is a tough case for the prosecution here in LA. It's a cold case, but I think they're doing a really good job of dirtying Robert Durst up. And I don't think the jury's going to like him, even though they don't have the physical evidence that they typically have in these types of cases.
Right. Weird. Not only did Kathleen Durst miss that first rotation that Dr. Safier described as, you know, unusual, but she missed graduation as well. I mean, this is sort of going into the painting of a picture of Kathleen Durst being a responsible person, someone who was trustworthy, someone who wouldn't do this. And so they're sort of kind of creating this cloud of mystery about what happened to her, and did Robert Durst have anything to do with it, right?
Yes, as a trial attorney, you got to tell a story. And the DA's story in this case is that Susan Berman literally knows where the bodies are buried. She was trying to shake down Bob Durst, and he was tired of paying her, and that's why he killed her. So, you know, the things that were sort of out of the ordinary were, you know, one, she's a responsible person who would never call out, especially the first day of rotation. This was back in the day where everyone would go to class and go to school no matter what, uphills both way in the snow. So that's sort of one. Two, that if you call, you know, you don't call the dean of the school, you call your immediate supervisor. And if you do, you certainly, you know, you leave a message in a timely manner, not late. So, you know, they're really trying to paint a picture of something that was really out of the ordinary. You know, a female calling, must have been Susan Berman, Durst's best friend. And that's why he had a motive to kill her, because she knew that he had killed his wife and she was trying to shake him down for money and extort him.
There was another line of question. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, to Neema's point, you know, context also matters, because we heard from other witnesses talking about Kathy's state of mind very close to the time of her disappearance, and the fact that she had told at least one witness, if I go missing or if something happens to me, it's Bobby.
Splitting hairs over the word probably? I mean, what's going on with this line of questioning?
Poor Dr. Safier, I'm sure he's really smart, but, you know, he got beat up a little bit on cross-examination there. I mean, Dick DeGurin is one of the best. I agree with Sarah. But really, I mean, drug use is going to be key in this case. You know, we know that Durst is going to say he may have been on methamphetamine when he made those admissions during the jinx, and that they were taken out of context, right? And we were going to hear about Susan Berman and Bob Durst's drug use at UCLA in the late 60s. So the defense wants to go on the offense and go after Kathy a little bit and say, you know, she may not have been this model citizen and student that the prosecution wants you to believe. So Safi really was kind of sticking his neck out and saying that, Kathy would not have called the dean if she were going to call out sick. So, he used some qualifiers there, and the
Right.
defense went after him and did a good job on
And
that.
it seems the defense is really trying to paint this picture that Kathleen Durst may have been responsible on one hand, but wasn't so responsible, at least according to the documentation that they presented there in that line of questioning, right?
Right, Derek. And if you're the state, again, you don't want to overextend, then you lose credibility. And I think that's what Dr. Safier did here. He really went out on a limb. He obviously didn't have this information about her evaluation and his radiology rotation. And now they've really sort of opened the door to that doubt that Sarah was talking about, that reasonable doubt. If you're the prosecution, you're arguing that this is someone that never missed class under any circumstances. And all of a sudden you have some documents that suggest the contrary, that she was out a lot.
From the start of this trial to now, because of the pandemic, does it raise issues in terms of memory, in terms of recollection, Neama? How much of the time has passed, not just because of the pandemic, but this case going back decades?
No question. We're already dealing with an old case, a 20-year-old murder. That's really the motive is almost a 40-year-old murder. So the fact that you have this 14-month gap, and what actually happened was because of this delay and the fact that a lot of the witnesses, as you can see, they're of advanced age, and now we're dealing with COVID, they actually had to testify under a pretty rarely used provision of the penal code that allows for these conditional hearings where you can videotape testimony and use it later. So I expect that's what's going to happen with Gilberta later on. We're going to be seeing that testimony. But it also raises potential appellate issues. That's what defense attorneys love. They filed 3 motions for mistrial. They've appealed this to the appellate court here in California, the 2nd Division. So these are something that, the state, even if they are able to get a guilty verdict, they're going to have to deal with these appellate issues. And we'll see if Bob Durst will survive all this. But it has really sort of muddied the waters here.
But it's the trunk of his car. There's a confession of some sorts going on, and you have blood of Mollie Tibbetts right there.
Derek, it really is a smoking gun, and I expected a guilty verdict in this case. Really, this case, the defense has to defend it on the merits, and that's why they're focusing on, this sloppy investigation issue. That's what they always do when there isn't really a strong defense, at least on the facts, right? So, they point to the fact that even at the milk farm, law enforcement just, took DNA swabs of all the Hispanic workers there, not the white owner of the farm. But this case isn't about, the DNA and, guilty or not guilty. It's really about that confession that I talked about earlier. And it's fascinating to see sort of the chess moves that are happening here. Really, the defense is trying to say that everything here is tainted. It's fruit of the poisonous tree. And this is all for appeal. So they're going to say because there was issues with the Miranda warnings and the knowing and voluntariness of the confession, all this evidence needs to be suppressed. And again, just for appeal. Whereas you see the prosecution arguing the opposite, that this is all subject to the inevitable discovery doctrine. So they're talking about how Mollie's body would have been found anyway, even though it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with what the jury's going to do in this case. It has everything to do with how the appellate courts will have to deal with this. Trying to say that this is a good father, this is someone who's not violent, despite what the former president said and the governor of Iowa said, he really doesn't have any criminal history, at least none that we know of, and certainly no violent criminal history. But I think what the state did in this case is say, look, this isn't necessarily someone who's violent, but this is someone who's creepy. This is someone who's a stalker. He admits to, driving up repeatedly on Mollie Tibbetts, saying she's attractive and hot. And when, his advances are rejected, that's when he loses it and he stabs her. Not just stabs her anywhere from 12 to 14 times. So I don't think you necessarily need the violence if you're the state when you have this sort of creepy behavior. Language issue is very important. That goes to the knowing and voluntariness of the confession. So something that the trial judge ruled on, but it's going to be revisited on appeal. So no question, it's an important issue, but also, your jurisdiction matters. And, someplace that's a little bit more diverse, like Los Angeles, that argument may go a little bit further. Unfortunately, you're dealing, and the reality is, with a very conservative part of the country and likely a conservative jury. I just think it's unlikely the defense will be successful in this case. For that reason.
I mean, he really doesn't have a jury of his peers, right? I mean, jury of your peers does not mean they have to be exactly like you, but they're all white except for one person.
The takeaway from his testimony there, it seems that he's saying other DNA markers were found in the trunk of Christian Rivera's car other than his own and that of Mollie Tibbetts. Is that raising some sort of doubt there, or is that just to be the normal case of the trunk of a car having other DNA evidence because it's used by maybe other people, or maybe other hands might have been in it earlier than the actual murder?
Well, Sarah nailed it when she earlier said this is a tough case to defend, and she's one of the best defense attorneys. So, you really are, stuck if you're the defense in this case. You have Dr. Spence there who's saying that there's other DNA in the vehicle. Again, sort of raises that specter of reasonable doubt, sloppy investigation. The prosecution and the state and law enforcement didn't really do their due diligence and rule out other suspects, but doesn't really advance the ball for the defense theory. The bottom line is, even if there's another female's DNA in that trunk, Mollie Tibbetts' blood was in the trunk of that vehicle, and she has no business being in the trunk of any vehicle.
Today, in this Doomsday couple case, really a signal that prosecutors have the evidence they need to at least prosecute this couple.
No question, Derek. Today is a big day in the Daybell Doomsday Colt case, and actually it's what would have been JJ's 9th birthday, so it's an appropriate day for these charges to finally be brought. Justice delayed is certainly justice denied, and there's some charges that were expected and some others that weren't so expected. We can start with the expected, which were the murder, first-degree murder, and conspiracy to commit murder charges against Chad and Lori related to the deaths of JJ and Tylee. The children were dismembered, burned, and buried in Chad's backyard. So I question why it took so long to bring those charges, but I'm glad the grand jury has finally returned an indictment. And then what was probably unexpected, but not surprising, is the Social Security fraud charges related to the children. But what we didn't expect are the murder charges against Chad Daybell only with respect to his ex-wife's killing, Tammy. So that's something that obviously we had suspicions, both attorneys, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the media. But now that Chad is looking at those murder charges, and it's interesting because it's Chad only, even though it's a conspiracy charge. So I want to know what facts they have and who he was conspiring with to kill his ex-wife. Right. And the motive may have been her life insurance, because those were the those were the additional charges that we weren't expecting to see today, that he committed fraud, life insurance fraud, by killing his ex-wife.
Yeah, we will see what the facts of the case bear out. But once again, we've got breaking news in the case of the Doomsday couple, Chad and Lori Daybell, now charged with murder in the death of Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, and Lori's children, Tyler and JJ. Susan Berman, allegedly to stop her from talking to investigators about the murder of his first wife, Kathleen Durst. That case is really gaining a lot of attention, right, Neama?
No question. We have not had jury trials in LA County for quite some time, and this is really the first on the list, both because of the age of the case, the fact that it's a murder, but really potentially a double or triple murder, and the fact that it started and had to stop because of COVID. So folks have been anticipating this for quite some time.
Early on in her testimony, recounting how she knew Kathleen Durst and calling what happened to her, her disappearance, horrible.
Yeah, I agree with Adam on this one. You have Dr. Marcus here, who's really, again, like her husband, Dr. Safier, overextending herself. She doesn't need to go to the 99.9% or 0% or take these really sort of hard, aggressive positions like ludicrous. You sort of box yourself in a corner if you're the witness, and you get subject to cross-examination and being beat up like she is, just like her husband was. You just want to take a little bit of a nuanced approach like some of the other medical students. I think that's a lot easier to defend and more believable for the jurors.
Yeah, you got to wonder if the prosecution coached her on, answering the question and only the question and not going too far. She does seem to be taking some liberties in terms of analyzing the questioning that's being thrown at her by the defense.